buenas noches. Welcome everybody. My name is Alberto Hernandez Banucci. I'm a Centro's librarian and archivist. We want to welcome you to our second book presentation on the Meet the Author series for this spring. We also want to thank our coordinators, Rosalie Roman and Eleni Collazo, for working so hard in the last 2 days because we, as you know, there was a fire in the cafeteria. We had to change the venue, the catering, everything. So they were very eager to help us, and you can see the results. Also, for your information, there's some books are for sale here. The presentation today is the book Puerto Rican Citizen by Dr. Lorrin Thomas, who is here with us tonight, along with historian Aldo Lauria from Rutgers University and political scientist Edgardo Meléndez. They're accompanied by Dr. Edna Acosta-Belén, who is a moderator and also a distinguished professor of Latin American, Caribbean, and the U.S. Latino Studies and Women's Studies at the University at Albany and SUNY. She received her PhD from Columbia University and has been a postdoctoral fellow at Princeton and Yale Universities, and also a visiting professor at Cornell. She's currently editor of the Latino Research Review. Some of her book publications include Puerto Ricans in the USA, A Contemporary Portrait, Adiós Borinquen Querida, The Puerto Rican Diaspora, Its History and Contributions, Researching Women in Latin America and the Caribbean, and the Puerto Rican Women, Perspective on Culture, History, and Society. Please welcome our guest and also Edna Costa.
Before we begin tonight's event, I want to thank the Centro de Estudios Puertorriqueños, its director, Edwin Meléndez, and Library and Archives Director, Alberto Hernandez Banucci, for organizing this activity and inviting me to chair and join this Meet the Author panel with Professor Lorrin Thomas, author of Puerto Rican Citizen, History and Political Identity in 20th Century Puerto Rico, published by the University of Chicago Press in 2010. I am very pleased to welcome you to this event and to be here with Lorrin and my Puerto Rican Studies colleagues, Edgardo Meléndez and Aldo Lauria Santiago. Since Professor Thomas has the starring role as well as the hot seat in this central event, she will be our first speaker this evening and describe for us different aspects of the research journey that made Puerto Rican Citizen come to fruition. After her presentation, Professor Thomas will hear comments about her book from the three invited commentators. Yours truly first, followed by Edgardo and then Aldo. And then Lorrin will have the opportunity to respond to some of our remarks if she wants to, before we open the floor for questions and discussion with the audience. Without further delay, let me proceed to welcome and introduce Professor Lorrin Thomas. She's an assistant professor of history at Rutgers University, Camden. She received her doctoral degree in history from the University of Pennsylvania and was a recipient of an Woodrow Wilson postdoctoral fellowship. Her interest in doing research about New York's Puerto Rican community began with her doctoral dissertation. And her first book, Puerto Rican Citizen, reflects her research interest on issues of equality, rights, and citizenship. The book received this year's Salutos Prize from the Organization of American Historians. Professor Thomas also has published several articles in journals such as Centro Journal and Latino Studies, and in various edited collections. Dejo con ustedes a Lorrin Thomas.
Thank you, Edna. Thanks to fellow panelists and to my friends at the Centro for organizing this and for supporting me for the last 10 years, or maybe even more, depending on how Pedro counts it. I thought I would just, I'm not going to speak for too long, I don't think. Not right now, anyway. I thought I would say just a few things about how this book got started, how I conceptualized it kind of at the beginning, and how it grew and changed along the way. I don't want to dwell too much on the dissertation part of it, although that's, that's sort of obviously an important part of where a lot of the ideas began, although they've spent a long time germinating. And some of them were still moving and changing in my head, even at the very end of the manuscript writing process. So I guess I started out thinking that I would write a social history of citizenship. There was, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War, a kind of burgeoning interest in the idea of citizenship, not just in its formal dimensions, but in terms of how states used citizenship in relationships of groups within states, among states. A lot of this was happening in the context of Europe and the changes that were happening there after 1989. And I was intrigued by a lot of this scholarship, but I found it very lacking in the social history kind of experiential, subjective dimension. And because I was in graduate school studying both US and Latin American history, and knew that I would probably wind up writing a dissertation on some kind of migration project, I became increasingly fascinated by the case of Puerto Rico and by the exceptional experience of Puerto Ricans as immigrants in the United States who arrived here with citizenship, and wanted to know more about what it actually meant. So this case study seemed to me to be kind of an ideal convergence of various interests of mine. And I thought, as I kind of made a couple of investigative trips to the Centro archive, I realized that there was a lot that I could work with to try to figure out this social history, this experiential aspect of citizenship, and to move the study of citizenship away from just the kind of legal or political science focus and into something that actually had more to do with people and what it meant. The other thing that intrigued me as I explored the archive was that it seemed that there was so little that had been written about the experience of Puerto Ricans in the United States. At the time that I started, and practically, I mean, this is changing in the last few years, but Virginia Sanchez-Corral's book, early 1980s book, From Colonia to Community, was the only book-length published work on Puerto Rican history in the United States. It was followed shortly after that by Carmen Whalen's excellent study of Puerto Ricans in Philadelphia, which was a slightly later period. But the point is that I felt that I was following in Sanchez-Corral's footsteps in kind of figuring out the outlines of a story that very few people had told. There were a few articles written by historians in the Central Journal, very little else written in other historical journals. And that was both, of course, exciting and daunting because there wasn't a whole lot to go on. I leaned heavily on Sanchez-Corral's book in figuring out the outlines of this early community, but also dove into pretty much reading the newspaper, the main Spanish language newspaper, La Prensa, which started its publication in 1919. I read not every word, but every day of that newspaper into the 1940s. Pedro remembers. I would sit at the microfilm reader day after day for months and months and months. First, just getting a feel for what had happened. I mean, getting a sense of what the concerns of the community were at different points. I was able to combine that initial research with the really amazing files, the papers of the early Puerto Rican activist Jesus Colon, his colleague Erasmo Lando, whose papers were somewhat smaller in size, but also extremely helpful, Bernardo Vega's memoir, and piecing together some kind of major events and key ideas, and getting a sense of the themes that I really wanted to explore. And so I'm just going to sort of give you a rough kind of decade by decade outline of eras, major eras, where I think that perceptions about citizenship and its meanings had different tones, and there were sort of different debates and conversations at different points. You can get this from the book, but I'll give you the cliff notes here, and then say a little bit more about how the real substance and kind of analytical ideas grew from this skeletal understanding. So what I saw, I think by the end of that first year of research, I had a pretty clear sense of these different eras and an understanding that the meaning of citizenship changed dramatically over time, and of course depended on context. And so what I identified was a handful of major shifts. The community was well established, maybe 30 to 40,000 people by the end of the 1920s. And that era, for the most part, was marked by a sense of hopeful expectation about being immigrants who were also U.S. citizens, about the promises of political access that citizenship seemed to promise, and the idea that, like other immigrants before them, Puerto Ricans would be able to tap into connection with major political parties and politics in the city, and be able to gain some benefits of being voters, not just being residents of the city, but actually being voters and participating in those kind of urban political organizations. And for various reasons that you'll have to read about in the book, that began to change notably by the end of the 1920s. And there was a marked shift by the early 30s that, of course, had a lot to do with the Great Depression, but there were some other major factors too, where the most interesting debates that I identified, and a lot of this was through like letters to the editor and some kind of organizational activity that I saw in the papers, especially of Jesus Colon, but I saw an emerging set of concerns that Puerto Ricans were being lumped together by other New Yorkers, by other white people in the United States with African Americans, and that their citizenship would be kind of funneled into this, and they did use this term sometimes in the 30s, second-class status. And so the hopefulness and kind of expectation of the 1920s gave way to a more wary, I wouldn't even, not doubtfulness, but a kind of wariness. And then quickly, by the mid-30s, by the mid to late 30s, the tumultuous events in Puerto Rico and the kind of conflicts over island nationalism really affected the more politically engaged sectors of the community here in New York. And that added yet another kind of complex dimension to the sense that perhaps this idea that we are, Americans just like the rest of them isn't actually the whole story. And that complicated both politics on the ground in the Puerto Rican communities in New York, but also the place of Puerto Ricans in the Democratic Party, which is one of the arguments that I make in the book about that period. Now just briefly breezing along into the 1940s, World War II, of course, again, changed everything about sort of how individual people and groups of people in the within the nation state saw themselves and saw their relationship to their country. There was certainly, in a way, a sort of distraction of the war, where a lot of even leftist activists were caught up in anti-fascist movements and were kind of basically supportive of the Allied position in the war. And so these questions about, who are we and what kind of incipient discrimination are we facing in this country, those questions faded for a time during the early 40s. And then things changed radically once again, not long after World War II, when the major migration of Puerto Ricans began from the island, up to more than 50,000 a year for 7 or 8 or close to 10 years throughout the 50s. And at that point, the more politically engaged sectors of the community talked about the meanings of their citizenship and focused on citizenship in a way, but they were kind of overwhelmed by this need to respond to the negative local press and the kind of extreme and visceral and racist discrimination that the new migrants were facing. So once again, the kind of I would say the larger political questions about who are we in the nation were subsumed by this kind of day-to-day struggle to counter these discourses about Puerto Ricans, ruling the city and being terrible immigrants, which of course was nothing new. I mean, it was the same kinds of discourse that people had used in the late 19th century about Southern Europeans, about Jews and Italians. And that just kind of diluted the larger political questions for a time. And so there was a lot of emphasis on kind of the questions of belonging, the belonging components of citizenship, but not much about the larger political questions, and certainly less focus on the continuing problems of colonialism and critiques of the United States as a colonial power that had begun to emerge in certain ways in the 1940s. And then once again, everything, well, not overnight, but gradually over time in the 60s, the ideas about kind of political identity and who are we in the nation and what role does citizenship play changed radically once again, although it was sort of a slower progression. So what happened, I think, in those few years, just a few years after I finished the dissertation, as I was working on the manuscript, is that I began to see that the book's themes were not really just about what I had started out calling the meanings of citizenship. That a more important theme in the book was a steady and fairly interconnected series of critiques of citizenship, conceptualizations of group membership beyond citizenship in the United States. And that was the puzzle that I found incredibly intriguing. I mean, I always said, even by the time I finished my dissertation, I was still interested in it. I was glad to continue to work on it as a book. But at that time, I wasn't even sort of aware or I hadn't fully understood the things that really intrigued me and that continued to animate me as I changed the dissertation into a book. And that really was this idea that it wasn't primarily a book just about citizenship. It was about these critiques. It was about pushing ideas of democratic liberalism beyond the limitations of liberal citizenship, and the really fascinating and incisive ways that so many politically active Puerto Ricans had articulated this at various points. And one thing I felt I was able to do, and I mean, I think I'll say, I think this is one of the strengths of the book, is connecting the ways in which a lot of different activists in different periods were actually saying some similar things and didn't fully realize it. Because, generations of people often don't, especially if there's not a coherent narrative about who they are and what they've done and what they've accomplished, generations of people often don't have that sense of, who came before them, who are my predecessors, what's the genealogy of our not just ideology, but our sort of, conceptual and intellectual spirit. And so, what most fascinated me, and I think you can see this in the book, especially in the last chapter, is the resonances between the activists of the 1960s and those of the 1930s. So to me, this story emerged, this coherent story of these critiques, of this imagining of something, and I won't call it a coherent something. I think that the story of the critiques is coherent. I think the conceptualization of something beyond democratic liberal citizenship isn't necessarily coherent, because none of us have come up with that kind of coherent new narrative, new idea. But it really was a coherent story of challenging and trying to come up with something different, and seeing where the cracks were, and seeing what those cracks and limitations were about, which was often, colonialism and racism at their core. Now, as I was trying to make sense of how to talk about these critiques, I did a lot of reading in political philosophy, and I got really intrigued with the kind of political theory literature on recognition, the idea of recognition as a political critique of some form of membership that's separate from liberal citizenship. I'm not going to try to say too much about it here. There's maybe a little more than some people want of that in the book. I know Aldo kept asking me if I really needed to write all that stuff about the political theorists. I put some of it into footnotes, and I know Angelo Falcone wrote that he really, in his review in the National Institute of Latino Policy, that he really liked the book, except for the overly theoretical introduction. But I still felt that I had to do it. I did it for myself, I'll admit it. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about that. One last set of points, I want to return to my archival work and say a few things about what it was like in a little more detail, working with the archival materials that I worked with, the vast majority of which were here. I did a fair amount of research at the Municipal Archive at different points in Mayor's papers, also in the WPA papers, not all the WPA papers, but the Municipal Archive houses a whole bunch of reels of manuscript from the Federal Writers Project and some other documents that were really incredibly helpful, writing about Harlem and other parts of New York in the 30s and 40s. I did a little bit of work at the Tamiment Labor Archive, or whatever the precise name is, at NYU, and I probably forget, the papers of an Italian-American activist and educator in East Harlem, in the papers of Leonard Cavello, which are at the Balch Institute in Philadelphia. But anyway, most of my time in the archives was spent here at the Centro, and as I was thinking about this, I realized that just as I came up with this sort of schema about how citizenship changed over the sort of decade/eras, I also had a kind of similar parallel sense of how my research changed, or how it felt different in these different time periods. And it occurred to me that doing research on the 20s and 30s, and I mean, this is even with Virginia Sanchez Corral's book as my guide, it felt a bit like archaeology, like unearthing things that nobody had cared to look at in the past. And that's a slight overstatement, because a few people have published a few things about those early pioneros. But for the most part, I felt like I was really digging, and I loved it. It was a little bit unnerving, and I felt scared sometimes that I wasn't gonna figure this out, that I wasn't gonna know what was really going on, and I mean that feeling got better over time. And then the 40s and the 50s, to continue with sort of different bizarre metaphors of, to try to explain what it was like, was sort of like this sprawling and intricate puzzle. There were so many pieces, but I did feel that it was possible to fit them together and that I could manage to do it. I mean, not that this research was linear and I didn't go in chronological order necessarily, but having gotten through the experience of having some sense about what was happening in the 20s and the 30s when there was so much, relatively less archival material, I felt that I was up to the task and that it was a puzzle that I could make some sense of. And I just want to give you a few examples of some of the ironies and synchronicities of fitting together some of those pieces. These all center around West Side Story, believe it or not. I discovered, for instance, and these were just these serendipitous convergences that wouldn't necessarily hit me over the head at the time, but I'd be taking notes and then writing something, and then I think, wait, I read about this in some other place, and wasn't that the same date or the same newspaper or something like that? So this set of examples involves first the controversy over building the Lincoln Center, which was early fall 1957. The controversy was emerging. Residents who were going to be cleared out of the area were beginning to protest in September, October 1957. It was hitting the newspapers. There was a lawsuit that was being put together to challenge the city's move to clear out these hundreds of Puerto Rican families that would be displaced by the construction of Lincoln Center. And this was just at the moment that West Side Story was premiering on Broadway. And of course, the story was set, the story of West Side Story, not only was the irony that, the first major representation of Puerto Ricans in New York's cultural life was happening at the same time that the city was clearing out all these families. That major cultural representation was about the West Side, the very place that that was being affected by Lincoln Center. So that's one kind of ironic thing. And then this is sort of a smaller thing, and it may not have been totally coincidental. There was a visit by the San Juan's mayor, Felisa Rincon, to New York City on the day of the West Side Story premiere, also in 1957. And then 2 years later, when the actual demolitions of the West Side began in early September 1959, the newspapers, especially the Spanish language papers, El Diario at that point, were sharing space, sometimes on the same page, between the Cape Man murders that had just happened in that, late August, I think it happened in late August. It was still, an uproar by early September, and the demolition of this Puerto Rican neighborhood was happening simultaneously. So that's one example of this sense of fitting pieces of a puzzle together. Very intricate. I often felt like I could be missing things, and I wasn't ever sure that I was being as organized as I could be to keep track of things and tell the story as vividly as it began to feel to me. But certainly my sense of my grasp of the 40s and 50s was different than the way I felt when I was doing my research on the 20s and 30s. And then finally, okay, this is maybe the hardest metaphor to explain, but I think it might make sense to you. In trying to understand the 60s and the 70s, I think the best way to explain my sense of my sometimes partial understanding of that very complicated period is if you imagine a Cubist painting, which, Cubism it captures this idea that you can see things from multiple perspectives at the same time, right? So my sense of this being a Cubist painting was really that I got one set of, it was part of a Cubist painting. I was like, you know, only able to see maybe a couple of dimensions. They were complicated, conflicting, so it's like, imagine, you know, Picasso halfway through one of his masterpieces. Well, I shouldn't even use the word masterpiece, but I guess both in terms of documentary evidence and in terms of the complexity of events, there were times when I felt overwhelmed by trying to sort through all these different dimensions and how they were layered on top of one another, and how different voices had different ways of interpreting so many different things. Actually, my sense, I wouldn't be so self-deprecating as to say that I think this is, I don't think it's a weak part of the book per se. In general, it's just that I realized that I may have managed to capture only a partial version of this enormously complicated and full and rich period that was sort of exploding in a good way in El Barrio and other Puerto Rican neighborhoods all over the city and elsewhere in the country. And this sense of my kind of partial coverage of this period was confirmed for me, and I had a really nice interaction with the literature scholar Roberto Marquez, who I actually quote in the book, and Aldo introduced him to me last fall, and he said, you know, he had this serendipitous thing where he'd stumbled on my book in the bookstore. He didn't know anything about it. He bought it because it was about Puerto Ricans. He read it. He said he loved it, especially the part about the 20s and 30s. And then he said, you know, the implication was, you know, by the time he got to the 50s and 60s, which is the part of New York that he lived through, he wasn't so sure that I got it right all the time. But I was willing, you know, I was willing to accept that. I think that I am surrounded by people who lived through those times and who have insights about things that actually happened, and that in some cases they actually were participating in, that I will never be able to capture. I mean, I recognize that it's a partial story in that sense, but I hope it's not inaccurate. I mean, Roberto made it sound like he was at least kind of entertained and willing to go along with a lot of the things I said, even if it didn't give him a sense that I got everything right. So I think I'll stop there with that Cubist painting metaphor and listen to other people try to fill in the rest. Thanks.
Let me start my remarks by saying that it is always a pleasure to read and have the opportunity to comment on such an engaging, well-documented, and important book as Puerto Rican Citizen, which in my opinion offers one of the most comprehensive and insightful renderings to date of what Professor Thomas refers to as the struggle for recognition of Puerto Rican migrants in New York City. Puerto Rican Citizen focuses on the history of Puerto Rican social and political activism that spans from the 1920s to the 1970s, like Lorrin explained. At least half of the book chapters are dedicated to the formative period of the New York Puerto Rican community, that is the decades from the 1920s to the 1940s that preceded the post-World War II Great Migration, a period which was largely overlooked in most of the major studies of Puerto Rican migration published before the mid-1970s. My comments tonight will focus primarily on the overall significance of this portion of the book. I'm also a baby boomer like Roberto, so I am going to comment on the part that I enjoyed the most. As I immerse myself in the world recreated by Professor Thomas in this compelling account of Puerto Rican life in New York City, I could not help recalling some similar intellectually stimulating reactions I had when Professor Virginia Sanchez Corrol, who was here tonight and regretfully had to leave to catch a train to Long Island, published the first edition of her book From Colonia to Community, The History of Puerto Ricans in New York City back in 1983. And I was invited to write a review of her book for a journal. As a scholar of what was then the burgeoning field of Puerto Rican studies, I realized at the time that unveiling and documenting this early period in the history of the migrant community, the first edition of Virginia's book covered the years between 1917 and 1948, was critical in illustrating the many ways in which the past can inform the present and the future of a community, and also be an inspiration and empowering force to the continuing struggles by its citizens for inclusion, and to be recognized as equals in a society that professes to be the worldwide symbol of economic opportunity and democratic values. In that review, I pointed out how Sanchez-Corral laid the groundwork and posed a challenge for further research on the early colonias, and forced a reconsideration of past interpretations and assumptions about the lives and activities of Puerto Rican migrants during this period. Although since then there have been other worthy scholarly efforts covering the early New York Puerto Rican community and its pioneers, they're still few in number, and I can say unequivocally that at least for the last 16 years in the publication of Ruth Glasser's book, My Music is My Flag, no other scholarly contribution on this particular period has so aptly brought together such a detailed historical narrative and built upon scholarship on the political and social history of the early community and the 2 decades after the Great Migration as Puerto Rican Citizen does. What makes Puerto Rican Citizen stand out is the skillful way in which Professor Thomas weaves a narrative path from the past to the present, where Puerto Ricans are no longer voiceless or passive subjects, but rather engaged social actors, defining their political identities, dealing with survival issues that affected the quality of their daily lives, and pursuing specific social and political agendas, even if most of the time the anticipated outcomes did not materialize. And it is also quite remarkable that Puerto Ricans persistently continued to do so in an environment where they were either silenced by being ignored or deemed invisible by the power structures in the society at large, or when they reached some level of visibility, subjected to the wounds of bigotry and demeaning mischaracterizations by the media and by the numerous scholars and policymakers who attempted to define them. Puerto Rican Citizen builds a historical narrative that traces the shifting terms that Puerto Rican community leaders use to negotiate their citizen rights, and in doing so provides a much needed sense of continuity and connectivity to the ways in which the specific content of Puerto Rican struggles in the city evolves through time. Although largely grounded in the local realities and lived experiences of Puerto Ricans in the city, the continuing commuter migration between the island and the U.S. and the island's unresolved colonial links with the U.S. allow Professor Thomas to show that these local struggles are rarely immune to socioeconomic and political developments and events in Puerto Rico. Departing from the knowledge Puerto Ricans were the first group of colonial migrants who were also U.S. citizens by congressional decree, Professor Thomas cleverly demonstrates how the content of Puerto Rican struggles of recognition, incorporation, and advancement in U.S. society shifted over several decades as Puerto Ricans become more aware of the fact that their second-class citizenship as colonial migrants of a mixed race would not grant them the equal treatment afforded to white citizens, and that their racialization as non-whites would force them to develop a critique of U.S. racism long before they were able to become more self-reflective about the racism that existed in their own culture. Most scholars of the Puerto Rican experience would agree that this early period of diaspora history remains understudied, perhaps because there are few substantive research studies available to build upon, since, as we well know, during the days before the founding of the Central Library and Archives, Puerto Rican studies researchers had to rely to a large extent on a prior body of scholarship about both the island and migrant communities that explained their poverty status and marginality with all kinds of collective pathologies, which are very well known now, so there's no need to recycle them here. and a literature that essentialized Puerto Ricans as a social quote-unquote problem or exception because of their ostensible failure to follow the more successful path of other ethnic groups before them. It was also a body of scholarship in which the voices of working-class Puerto Rican migrants were fundamentally absent. Thus, any historical reconstruction or historical counter-narratives of this period require the careful and discerning examination of largely untapped primary sources, foremost among them the Spanish language press and the papers of the migrant pioneers and their organizations that are now part of the Centro Archives, documents that allow us to hear the voices of the migrants themselves as they experience different aspects of their lives in the city. Professor Thomas has done an outstanding job in drawing on a wide range of sources. She has relied on primary material from La Prensa, like she explained, and El Diario, which, as you know, merged and remain as the Spanish language, merged as El Diario La Prensa, and remain as the largest Spanish language newspaper in the city. Through articles, editorials, and letters to the editor, to these and other periodicals, and from the records of some of the most important Puerto Rican organizations, the papers and oral accounts of some community leaders, the Migration Division papers, and information from the largely untapped Spanish book of the WPA Federal Writers Project, Professor Thomas methodically sorts out the different forms of social and political engagement that drew Puerto Ricans into collective action. Regarding the meticulous documentation work that Professor Thomas carried out for the book, I want to add that I really enjoyed the historical narrative she constructed in Puerto Rican Citizen, but was also enthralled by the footnotes. Since from a researcher's point of view, they often introduce important links to sources that you were not necessarily aware of, or offer new clues to the laborious process that is unveiling and reconstructing the historical past of the pre-Great Migration community. Scholars have learned a great deal from Bernardo Vega's memoirs, Jesus Colon's sketches, and his brother Joaquin Colon's personal accounts and journalistic chronicles. But there are still many less known and even anonymous voices dispersed in New York City's Spanish language newspapers, which according to Nicolás Canelos and Helvetia Martel's Geographic Index, includes over 300 periodicals, more than 24 of them published between 1900 and 1960, that are valuable sources in reconstructing the early history of the Puerto Rican community. And of course, I regret that Lorrin didn't look at some of the smaller Spanish language newspapers published at various times during this period. Many of the voices in the city's Spanish language press represent indispensable threads of memory that will continue to mend that Arcadio Díaz-Quiñones has called, what Arcadio Díaz-Quiñones has called la memoria rota, a collective historical memory fragmented by the Puerto Rican colonial experience that for a long time disconnected Puerto Ricans from their own history and subjected them to the silences and distortions of official history. Despite all the decolonization of knowledge about Puerto Ricans that has taken place since the late 1960s, this memoria rota also has contributed, among other things, to a certain level of either historical disconnect or amnesia among Puerto Ricans themselves regarding the origins of their present struggles and productive roles in U.S. society, and perhaps even more so to a historical divide between island and statewide communities. As windows open into the past that allow researchers to uncover the neglected or buried history of the early pioneers, the more researchers will have a clearer sense of the continuities, discontinuities, and interconnections between and among different migrant generations and stages in the formation of the New York City community. We also will gain a better sense of the transnational connections between island and stateside communities at different points in time. And in this sense, Puerto Rican Citizens represents a major leap in that direction for this and some of the following additional reasons. First, there are few studies written by non-Puerto Ricans which show a thorough knowledge and insightful analysis of all the new scholarship on Puerto Ricans in both island and stateside communities. and not only makes extensive use of the central archival resources and materials, but also some of the still largely untapped resource that is the Spanish language press, especially in reconstructing community life in the early decades of the 20th century, and in learning about the core issues that shape Puerto Rican diasporic identities in those years. I feel compelled to add here that there's still an earlier period of Puerto Rican presence in New York City that has not received enough attention by researchers, not even in Puerto Rican citizens, and which encompasses the latter decades of the 19th century and the first 2 decades of the 20th. Another point I want to make about Puerto Rican citizens is that the kind of analysis that Professor Thomas provides does not shy away from pointing out the biases and shortcomings of previous scholarship, which before the 1970s was largely written by, with few exceptions, North Americans. Neither does she retreat from addressing many of the complexities, contradictions, and divisions within the Puerto Rican community itself, especially around sensitive or controversial issues of racialization and racism, social class differences, and debates over the political status of Puerto Rico. Her analysis also does not recoil from exposing the structural forces and power relations in the New York City political arena and the wider US society that constrain the possibilities for Puerto Ricans to be more successful in their quest for recognition and prosperity, or from indicating the fissures and failures of American democracy towards its citizens of color, or criticizing what she calls the quote-unquote sweeping colonialism under the rug perspective of many of the previous US scholars and policymakers who studied and wrote about Puerto Ricans, a perspective that for a long time allowed American history to erase from the official narratives of this nation what Amy Kaplan referred to as the quote-unquote cultures of US imperialism. Finally, as a Puerto Rican citizen of the diaspora who migrated to the United States for a, entre comillas, temporary stay of over 43 years, I could not overlook the different kinds of emotions that a historical narrative such as Puerto Rican citizen elicits, from feelings of anger and the persistent racist bigotry so frequently spouted at Puerto Ricans, and the inequalities and demeaning treatment that they have historically endured in US society, to the disillusionment about the slow socioeconomic progress and still unfulfilled promises and disregard by government institutions. But most of all, there is the sobering reality that the history of US ethno-racial minorities in general have never fully penetrated the consciousness of the wider population as an inherent part of American history. A history that has not been very self-reflective about or able to come to terms with a long legacy of racism, apartheid, and inequalities that, as Professor Thomas rightly notes in her book, contradicts and violates the basic precepts of liberal democracy. That this is so only underscores the importance for Puerto Ricans and other minorities to enhance their historical consciousness of their present contributions and the structural and political conditions and sources of oppression that hinder their advancement in US society. A way of making progress on this latter point is emphasizing the importance for these groups to become what Adrian Rich, in referring to the act of resisting amnesia in women's history, called being, quote-unquote, consciously historical. This process of resisting historical amnesia and becoming consciously historical involves striving for memory and connectedness with the past, which in itself represents a never-ending, ever-changing, and contentious endeavor. However, books such as Puerto Rican Citizen are a most welcome addition to the process of reinvigorating the historical memory and consciousness of the diaspora. In documenting a long tradition of engagement by Puerto Ricans in civil rights struggles for equality and inclusion, long before the civil rights era of the 1960s, Professor Thomas' book imparts these struggles with a sense of connectedness to a historical past that stands as a source of inspiration and empowerment for Puerto Ricans in present and future strides for social change, human dignity, and a better society. The memory of this history and rich legacy is also an important point of reference for collective and personal learning and healing about the accomplishments as well as the failures and unrealized goals of the past, while stirring a craving for the possibility of bridging the past or bringing the past into accountability in the present. Bernardo Vega stated in his memoirs that, and I quote, "Without a doubt, in order to stand on our 2 feet, Puerto Ricans of all generations must begin by affirming our own history. It is as if we are saying we have roots, therefore we are." Adrian Rich also wrote, again in reference to women's history, that, and I quote, "We cannot build on what has been done before, if we do not even know it is there to build on. In that respect, Puerto Rican citizen offers us the kind of knowledge of the past that would definitely allow other scholars to continue building upon." Thank you. Our next speaker will be Professor Edgardo Meléndez, who is a full professor in the Department of Africana and Puerto Rican Latino Studies at Hunter College. He holds a PhD in political science from CUNY's Graduate Center. In some of his book publications include Puerto Rican Government and Politics, a Comprehensive Bibliography, Partidos, Política Pública y Estatus en Puerto Rico, Puerto Rico en Patria, and Movimiento Anexionista en Puerto Rico. Con ustedes, Edgardo Meléndez.
Thank you, Edna. I will also read my presentation to save some time. Puerto Rican Citizen is an excellent contribution to the history of Puerto Ricans in New York City from the 1920s to the 1970s. Its extensive look at the community's development through so many decades is sustained by thorough primary research and attention to many issues that characterize Puerto Rican struggles during most of the 20th century. The book travels the road studied before by such classic texts as Bernardo Vega's memoirs and Virginia Sanchez Corral's From Colonia to Community, but adds new archival material and topics to the understanding of this community's evolution in the first half of the 20th century. In addition, Thomas extends her analysis to the 1970s and provides new insights and some coherence into a period studied by several scholars and activists in a somewhat fragmented fashion. Puerto Rican Citizen thus presents a very extensive and yet a very detailed panorama of Puerto Rican history in New York City for most of the 20th century. Perhaps the book's major contribution is its focus on the relationship between U.S. citizenship and Puerto Rican incorporation in New York City. Thomas's central argument is that although U.S. citizens since 1917, Puerto Ricans, and I quote, "the United States' first and only citizen immigrants," end of quote, remain, quote, "invisible," end of quote, to New York City politics and society for the first half of the 20th century. Puerto Rican invisibility is rooted in Puerto Rico's colonial status, and thus Puerto Rican status as colonial citizens. A corollary of this invisibility is the political marginalization of Puerto Ricans throughout most of the 20th century. Thomas argues that as a consequence of this status, a defining element in the struggles of Puerto Ricans in New York City has been the attempt to get recognition for their presence in the city, with all that implies socially, economically, culturally, and politically. These three elements, colonial citizenship, invisibility, and the struggle for recognition, define the evolution of the community in the period under study according to the author. And thus, they are central topics in all of the chapters. Another important element in the book is how Thomas discusses the way Puerto Ricans view themselves and how others perceive them as members of the city, that is, their ethnic and racial identity in the United States. This identity, she argues, transforms historically from one of colonial immigrants in the 1920s to radical citizens demanding equal rights and social justice in the 1970s. The book's richly detailed research and complex analysis cannot be justly assessed in a limited presentation. I will thus touch on a few topics of interest. The book's chapters follow the traditional periodization we have grown accustomed to: the development of the colonia in the 1920s, the economic crisis during the 1930s, and the rise of nationalism and so on and so forth. But Thomas's discussion of these periods presents a different perspective on how to analyze the historical evolution of the Puerto Rican community. For example, her chapter on the 1920s deals with the differences between the Brooklyn and the East Harlem colonias, as well as with conflicts with other ethnic groups. The discussion on the 1930s centers on how Puerto Ricans dealt with and how they were positioned within the American racial structure. This chapter discusses, for example, two distinct yet interrelated accounts of on racial accommodation. Thomas analyzes the identification cards filed in the Puerto Rican government's Office of Employment and Identification in the 1930s, and how migrants and bureaucrats played with racial identification in the metropolis. The other is an extremely telling account of the 1935 Harlem riots that erupted as a consequence of the actions of a black Puerto Rican youth. Chapter 3 centers on the effects of academia. Her extensive analysis of the Puerto Rican problem, quote unquote, from the late 1940s to the late 1950s provides a much needed account of this important phenomenon in the post-war incorporation of Puerto Ricans. Chapter 6 discusses the period from the 1950s to the early 1970s, examining well-known topics such as the role of the Migration Division in the community's development during these years, the emergence of a new generation of Puerto Ricans raised in New York City with their own interests in community development and social justice, and the radicalization of its young members by the late 1960s as represented by the Young Lords. The title of the book's final chapter, From Citizen to Nuyorican, offers a glimpse of the author's concluding remarks. There are many issues and topics discussed throughout the book regarding the history of Puerto Ricans in New York City, so I will just mention a few that might be considered most prominent. Thomas relates the incorporation of Puerto Ricans in New York City to the events and processes of different historical periods in the United States and the city. There is a continued emphasis on race issues, how Puerto Ricans defined racially in the U.S. and how they saw themselves within the American racial structure. The book also underscores the relationship between Puerto Ricans and African Americans, the neighbors in Harlem, and a basis for their racial identification by mainstream America. The continued linkages between the island and its diaspora, politically, socially, and culturally, is a persistent topic, as well as the different manifestations of Puerto Rican nationalism in the United States. While the, again I have to agree with Edna and Roberto, while the first three chapters that examine the period between the 1920s to 1945 are filled with very detailed research and discussions, the last three chapters of Puerto Rican Citizens, those that deal with the post-war period, are more general and lean more on secondary works. I am not finding fault on Thomas's excellent work, but simply pointing to an expected outcome of such an extensive historical work. As the community becomes more complex and large-scale, it is more difficult to cover all the historical events and processes worth the required attention. This is a consequence of the book's broad historical agenda and not a fault of the author's excellent scholarship. There are some minor errors in the book, dealing mostly with historical events in Puerto Rico, and one particularly seen in the musical West Side Story. But these are forgivable faults that should not detract from this excellent book. The book, however, would have benefited from a discussion on the nature of Puerto Rican's colonial citizenship. Thomas assumes this as a given, but we never read about what it is specifically in the U.S. citizenship of Puerto Ricans or in the political or constitutional status of Puerto Rico that makes Puerto Rican citizens in the United States so inferior and marginal. Race and cultural difference are important elements in this characterization, but these elements do not necessarily define them as colonial subjects. A discussion of why these colonial subjects, those citizens, were seen as alien and foreign to the United States would have been helpful to her argument. I would like to end my comments mentioning some implications of Thomas' book for future research on Puerto Rican citizenship. As we move along to the centenary of the extension or imposition, depending on who's making the statement, of American citizenship to Puerto Ricans in 1917, Puerto Rican citizens should be used as an example to follow on future research on this topic. As we know, almost all of this scant scholarly research on Puerto Ricans and U.S. citizenship has dealt with the implications of this institution for Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico. Recent scholarship on this issue, mostly related to the increasing literature on American empire, has provided new insights on its consequences for the United States and its colonial citizens. But we have to remember William Howard Taft's admonition in Balzac versus the people of Puerto Rico in 1922, that the most important right extended to Puerto Ricans by U.S. citizenship was the right to migrate freely to the United States, and that once there, they could then enjoy all the blessings and political rights of American citizenship. Puerto Rican citizen clearly shows how that went about. Thomas' book reveals the benefits and limitations of American colonial citizenship in the metropolis itself. This is something we all should remember when new writings and research emerged circa 2017 regarding the meaning of U.S. citizenship for Puerto Ricans. And if indeed more young and hopefully old scholars produce more fruitful research and writings on the role played by U.S. citizenship in the incorporation of Puerto Ricans in the United States, then Thomas, Puerto Rican citizen, will lead the way. This excellent work of research and analysis is not only a magnificent addition to the study of Puerto Ricans in the United States, but it must be required reading for those interested in the Puerto Rican experience as a whole, meaning, of course, that of the island and that of the U.S. territory. Thank you.
Now we will hear comments from Professor Aldo Santiago, who is an associate professor of history at Rutgers University in New Brunswick and chair of the Department of Latino and Caribbean Studies. He holds a PhD from the University of Chicago, and some of his publications include the books To Rise in Darkness, Revolution, Repression, and Memory in El Salvador, 1920 to 1932, Landscapes of Struggle, Politics, Community, and Society in El Salvador, and Identity and Struggle at the Margins of the Nation State, the Laboring Peoples of Central America and the Hispanic Caribbean. Professor Lauria Santiago is currently working on a labor history of Puerto Ricans in New York City. Professor
Thanks.
Lauria.
I'm going to try to do this in 10 minutes. I know it's a little late. And luckily, since I'm last, I have a fairly easy structure. I have 10 reasons why you should read this book. And then 12 footnotes. So, it's sort of a summary of what you just heard. So you'll remember, huh? Okay. And it's very hard for me to do this because I've met Lorrin 5 years ago when she was still working on the book manuscript. And so I've read various versions of it, and sometimes this is a very rich book. You should all read it. Just don't take our word for it. Just this book first places the. Let me get this thing here. It puts Puerto Ricans in New York in the context of larger things, which is one thing that's been missing in our knowledge of Puerto Ricans in New York. It puts it in a dialogue, it begins to put it in a dialogue, but we'll have to continue, that looks at Puerto Ricans in dialogue with African Americans, with Jews, Italians, with the city itself, with public officials. These are all pieces that have been missing from many of the ways we talk about Puerto Ricans in New York. It links it, obviously, as was mentioned before, to the context of the island's political history, very carefully, very nuanced. It has elements of integrating the presence and struggles of Puerto Ricans to New York's urban and political history. There are mayors in this story, there are civil commissions, there are committees that don't necessarily originate in the Puerto Rican community. And it highlights, in this context, the relationship between Puerto Rican politics and Puerto Rican struggles in a moment, 20s, but especially the 30s and 40s, when there were still reformers and a strong anti-racist coalitions in the city, many of which were of the left, which was very strong in New York, and complexifies the idea of Puerto Ricans in relation to whites in a period in which a lot of the whites had an anti-racial agenda. So this begins to be have a strong presence in this book, and it's something that has to be looked at more carefully. It also begins to get us away from the exceptionalist framing that we've had for at least some of the aspects of Puerto Rican experience in New York. It begins to make the Puerto Rican story comparable, but not to imply that it's parallel to the story of Italian Americans, African Americans, West Indians, and even implicit in there, could have forms on this, Asian Americans, including Chinese and Filipinos in New York. Reason number two. The book develops in a very rich and fluid and expanded way a definition of politics and citizenship. This is not your standard political science discussion of politics and citizenship, which is appropriate to the study of a racialized colonial and transnational citizens. This is a better approach than what's out there, than what's been written about Puerto Rican politics in general, but also even in the frame of studies of U.S. ethnic groups in an urban context. So there's an innovation there that I think applies to just in general the history of the study of race and ethnicity in U.S. urban contexts. And so that would be an interesting frame in which to look at the book. And it includes, closer to the examination of politics, voting patterns, public arena discussions of how things should be or could be, discussions of race and color, perspectives from leaders, organizations, and common people, all in the same way, in a very rich, integrated way, which is, in other words, it's a very rich definition of politics and a very active definition of what citizenship meant for the people in these stories. It's not just a formal category of law or rights, but it's a thing that is constantly being constructed and debated and so forth. 3. And this is one that I like. I hadn't realized that George Sanchez provides a commentary in the book, but this book is as good as George Sanchez's book on Mexicans in Los Angeles, which is a big award-winning book. And it's a piece that is very important, I think, for Puerto Rican history in the U.S., that there is a book now that Mexican-American historians have to read about the East Coast because they are decades ahead of us. It's great that it has that recognition, and the book itself has that quality of, let's read these two books together. And I encourage you to take a look at that book. It's a mid-80s book by now, 86, 88, hours and hours or months and months reading the press. It's amazing, that sense of as if we had been there, sort of as if we were all reading the press. Let's discuss what's been happening right now in New York City, and you get that sense of these guys are alive and alert with their immediate terrain, and that's something that newspapers provide. And there's the stuff that isn't there. You could write a different history from a deeper archive, but in terms of the public space, there's a tremendous contribution there. Okay. All right, number 5. The book puts leaders and leadership in context. There are leaders that you're familiar with, including Carlos Tapia on the front cover. But we reapproach those leaders in a way that, so this is you kind of zoom out a little bit in different steps. You get the piece about the leader, which but then you get the organizational context. You get a sense of larger frames for those leaders. And there's some unfamiliar leaders as well. Some names that you probably haven't encountered before and that should be recovered. Number 6, the book puts the 40s and 50s more centrally on the narrative map, which is something that's been missing in Puerto Rican historiography or for New York, and to some extent is not in Carmen Whalen's excellent book because it's just not completely part of the story there. And kind of breaks apart in many ways that big wall of, everything changes in a certain couple of years when large numbers of people start arriving. To some extent, yes, but to many ways, no. And it kind of bridges the first real second generation with the people that are migrating in larger numbers in the late 40s and 50s. The book also, number 7, avoids essentializations. This was mentioned earlier, especially when dealing with colonialism and anti-colonial politics, with race, color, national origin, and ethnicity, with interethnic relations, and with the complex politics of the community itself, right? Okay, number 8. It helps create a frame that other scholars and publicly this should continue, that puts the so-called Nuyorican generation in a dialogue with these earlier voices. And it's not as in it's 2 generations talking, it's more complex than that. And that's a very valuable contribution. There's probably a lot more that needs to be said about the perspective from late 60s through the 70s and how it connects to, or how it is echoed in earlier, but Lorrin addressed this, and I think this is a very valuable contribution of the book, and it's a dialogue that could continue publicly and among historians. This has to do with accomplishments, it has to do with ideology, it has to do with discourse and identity. Okay, number 9, it recovers, and this is one thing that I appreciate, some of the hopefulness and energy of Puerto Rican migration, which is sometimes lost a little bit. And this is a very difficult thing. You know, there's tremendous sense of loss, there's pain, there's discrimination, there's racism, there's all the urban problems that New York City had for Puerto Ricans. But it also reminds us of the hope of New Deal politics, of the positive spin of nationalism, of the rootedness of radical politics in the Puerto Rican community and the larger Latino community of the 30s and early 40s. It reminds us of the hopes and struggles of migrants, and those voices are in there. And number 10, how am I doing with time? Ooh, just 2 more minutes, okay. On the one hand, the book helps explain some traditional questions about failure, political failure. Well, how come we don't have more representation in X, Y, and Z in the government? There's some interesting arguments there about bad timing, about how machine politics in the city were changing, about what the New Deal meant for Puerto Ricans, about the question of colonialism, of course, how the racial piece. So as much as was mentioned a minute ago, each chapter has these different themes, you know, as you go through the decades. It builds up in a sense of helping explain some of the accumulated problems that are there in terms of at least a certain kind of politics of representation in government. Right? Of course, Lorrin has much more there about other kinds of politics and political making, right? through claims, right? And at the same time, on the other hand, it shifts the terrain to that other question. It shifts the question completely. From explaining failure, which is sometimes a theme out there in the literature, perhaps understandably so, to, you know, perhaps even flipping the question completely, is that why do they have problems with us? You know, what is it that Puerto Ricans do to liberalism that is so troubling to liberals? And there's a lot of that in the book, and it has to do with citizenship, it has to do with the island status, then it has to do with race. So it links all the way from the beginning. What kind of citizenship are we getting? All the way to the discourse of the young lords, to, you know what, we want a multiracial society. We don't want any of this nonsense. So there's this perpetual critique from different takes and different practices, and it's almost embedded in the culture. And this is something that could be explored further. Finally, and this is the footnotes, because I want to take this opportunity to do propaganda work for historical research, because Lorrin's work is so important that part of, I think, the goal of these forums is to stimulate further work, not just the reading of the book. I think we need, and this is something that if you read the book, you would see how every one of these things is sort of intersects with the book. We need a better history along these same lines, picking up where she leaves off, from the mid-60s through the 80s, in a traditional sense, communities, politics, organizations. We need a better look at housing. Housing is not too present here, but when you read the papers, 50% of everything that's ever been said about Puerto Ricans in New York have to do with housing, and it's mind-boggling how central that is. And that has to be looked at more carefully. We need a more labor-based socioeconomic history of Puerto Ricans in New York, which hopefully I'm working on. We need a more careful economic history, and this is to the social scientists in the room, of how the overlapping crises of the city, of public sector employment, from the early 70s through Reaganomics in the 80s, what impact it had on Puerto Ricans in New York in a historical frame, not just the numbers. With the numbers, with the quantitative piece, there's been a little bit of that work done, not well enough, but with some of the narrative sense of the communities, because this is a disastrous period for Puerto Ricans. And when you compare that period with this earlier stuff, if we could do that well, which we can't, with book in hand or books in hand, we would have a fuller picture and perhaps a better sense of why certain things were the way they were for at least some people. And in that sense, the story that Lorrin gives is a story of creative production compared to what's going to happen later, where there's kind of a harsher sense, starting in the lingering late 60s, early 70s, but definitely in the period that follows, of crisis, of extended crisis, of downward mobility for a lot of people. Right? Small pieces. We need more small pieces. There's so many small pieces. Nobody's written anything about Puerto Ricans in Loisaida or Williamsburg with any historical density, right? Etc. We could make the list. The Bronx. Where is there a good history of even resembling one of these chapters, right? We need that. Contradicting myself about the crisis piece, the Puerto Rican middle class. There is a middle class throughout all these stories, and sometimes they are in there fighting with other people, bodega owners, whatever, who buy buildings as they do their social work and their politics, or people who exile themselves from the community and do not want to go into those places, and they will say so, and that's in the record as well, right? And that's not just in the 20s, the ones that call themselves Españoles, but all the way through the whole story, right? Those stories need to be found out as well. So the question of diversities among these communities in the Puerto Rican diaspora. And then finally, I'll end with this, is to thank the Centro for developing these archives. I mean, it's just it's just amazing. There's the migration division papers and the newspaper collections alone. You could still do 20 dissertations, 30 dissertations out of those materials. There will be, in the next few years, keep your eyes open for this, and hopefully the Centro will be doing this sort of thing. There's about 7 books in the pipeline on Puerto Ricans in the U.S. and about 10 dissertations also being worked on right now. So there's a boom coming, and hopefully those of you who are practitioners, who have students, or who can get involved in this somehow will be listening and link up with this. And congratulations to Lorrin on this wonderful book.
Want to begin a discussion, have some remarks, or take questions from the audience?
Yeah, I don't have any remarks.
Okay.
I think I'll ask Edgardo privately what my errors were. We'll have that conversation later. And I just want to say thank you so much to all of you for reading carefully and thinking about it, and for being in conversation, and for leading the way, really.
So let's take some questions from the audience. Edwin.
I just want to acknowledge the tremendous piece of work that we had in 2009, and to thank the panelists. I haven't rarely seen a lineup of 3 senior scholars in the field acknowledging the first book of the scholar, who happens to be seminal to begin with. So I'm very proud of the work, and I congratulate you for what you've done. Let me ask you now. Puerto Ricans have another uniqueness, which is that there are plenty of immigrant groups that come through New York and adopted from the city as they go. But we had the uniqueness of being the first Latino group that really grew in mass and affected the city the way we have affected it. So my question to you, how is that uniqueness so telling to other Latino groups that are now going through the cycles that we went through in in asserting their own citizenship. As the, the paper is one thing, and the other thing is the reality of becoming. So I'm asking you, what is the telling of this case to others that Dominicans, Central Americans, and mostly Mexicans who are also becoming mass citizens?
Do you mean particularly as
far
as political?
Book, the act of citizenship is one of becoming. So asserting your right is one of struggle, is one of motivos, the riots. So and social movements take different shapes and forms. Immigrants' citizenship rights or legal rights is one form that they take. Yet the case of the Puerto Ricans who didn't have that barrier, yet they have to confront some of the same structural dynamics that you so richly portrayed and analyzed in the book. I don't want to repeat what the panelists say about what those dynamics are, but racial, cultural, and otherwise.
Right.
So my question is, what is it? What is the lesson? How is that Puerto Ricans, by becoming the banner of this Latino in Europe, what do we share with others?
And so you mean, of course, not just for those who are citizens or interested in becoming citizens. You mean just sort of as a struggle to be relevant members of.
Citizenship is becoming.
Right. So in the broader definition of citizenship as participants in a society, participants in a polity, whether or not they can vote. Well, what is the lesson? Well, I mean. One lesson certainly is appreciating the ways in which Puerto Ricans paved the way. I mean, in formal politics, in housing struggles, in education, and sit-ins and protests in universities in the early 1970s, and that. So those points, in a way, echo some of the things I said and that Aldo and the others also said about linking or remembering the power of understanding those who came before you, or maybe I should rephrase that, the power of understanding the connections with those who came before you. And it's not just about some kind of ethnic or national bond per se, but recognizing when you're sharing struggles and trying to do some similar things politically or in terms of just looking at what the precedents are and what tools people have used. I mean, and some of that is not translatable directly because things change so rapidly over time, and context is so important. But I think simply a kind of multi-dimensional understanding of a shared past is potentially pretty powerful. And I'm not sure what I can say beyond that, really. I mean, I know there's a lot of kind of low-level conflict and perhaps resentment among Latino groups, especially between Puerto Ricans and others who came later and who seem to be unaware of Puerto Ricans' long history in New York, unaware of the things that they've done and struggled with. Now, Puerto Ricans like lording it over Dominicans, for instance, that they've done all this before is not what I'm talking about. But I think an acknowledgement of their being pioneers is important, kind of symbolically, but also in terms of forging some kind of common identity as people with similar concerns. I mean, I'm talking about specifically in a political context, but yeah. Okay. I think I'll stop. I mean, maybe other people have some things they want to say about that, or any of you guys.
Too big.
Edwin, what about you?
Let other people.
All right.
I have something to say about that, but I'll say that.
All right.
I don't want to be as unfair as Edwin has been with this question. But I have a similar question, and he was making allusion to other aspects of the procedure city. And I am as interested in knowing how this history of Puerto Rican citizenship compares, differs, is similar to that of other racialized minorities in the United States. And I'm thinking minorities that are somewhat akin to Puerto Ricans, like Native Americans, American Indians, Hawaiian natives, Alaska natives, etc. People who have had a grounding in territory and have yet been colonized within the larger United States. Sorry. You'll put it the Mexicans.
Yeah, that actually was my first thought. I was like, but they didn't live in cities for the most part. I mean, I'm not sure what I can say right now. I don't want to just ramble. That's a really interesting question. I mean, in a general sense, they all share the experience of being people in this nation who expose the lie of the inclusive nature of democratic liberal citizenship. I mean, that's sort of the most kind of simple and I think accurate thing you could say that unifies them. I mean, sociologically speaking or experientially speaking, for the most part, Puerto Ricans haven't crossed paths literally or kind of ideologically with Native American people, although there are, you know, these kind of conceptual parallels, and that's I mean, I'll think about that, and it's something I think that, and as we get to the, somebody mentioned, Edgardo mentioned the upcoming anniversary of 2017. It's something that I think we should all probe a little more deeply. And thinking about, the history of citizenship in general in this country. Certainly, Filipinos, Native Americans, Puerto Ricans, all merit, should all be considered in one conversation about those issues.
Any more questions? Yes.
They mentioned your book in regards to the 20s and 30s and how in-depth it is, and then they mentioned the 60s and 70s, how it's a little bit more general. Were you thinking of doing maybe a part 2 to kind of go more in depth into that?
Not exactly. Well, Aldo and I talked about doing, maybe we'd start with just an article about some things going on in the 70s. Neighborhood and school politics, and looking more in depth at some of the materials that both of us have uncovered here and there, that some of mine that didn't make it into the book, some things that he's working on that don't fall into the labor history framework that he's working on, supposed to be working on in his book. So yeah, I mean, there's so much material and so much to do, and I've been pretty straightforward about understanding that I didn't necessarily kind of get the whole picture or even nail the picture that I did get. And yeah, I think there are a couple of books in the works mostly about the 70s, and there's more to come, and I hope to be part of it.
What was it that drew you to the whole idea, to the central study?
How far back do I go? Well, let's see. I was working on U.S. and Latin American history in graduate school. I finished my undergraduate training knowing that I was bored, frankly, thinking about U.S. history by itself. And so when I went to graduate school, I said to myself, well, I can study what I want. And I did. I knew I wanted to study the history of the Americas, not just the United States. And so then, I think I mentioned this a little bit in the beginning of my remarks, the idea of doing some kind of migration project seemed to make sense as a way to link the US and Latin America. I was interested in the problem of citizenship, kind of generally speaking. And so, in many ways, it was the Puerto Rican case as this unique example of making these connections, conceptual connections, was appealing to me. And then I think I started doing some work in the archive here, not specifically thinking about my dissertation. I was just working on like a kind of independent study project, and I just kind of fell in love with Jesus Colón's papers, really. And I mean, so that's where it started.
We have about 10-15 minutes to vacate the premises.
Oh.
And I want Lorrin to sign a book that I bought. So
We all want that,
I can buy the book here, and you can come to the table and get her to say a few
Right.
words for you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you.